Well, hopefully that's better this time. We had to relaunch the show, had a few little tech difficulties, but hey, that's the joy of the internet age, right? But
It
hey,
is.
I'll jump in and say that we have had some other issues before with getting comments and stuff on Facebook. So we're going to try something new for a little while. We're just going to do our live from YouTube and then just share that on our other social media platforms. So this is going to mean if you want to engage with us and comment, leave questions, all that kind of good stuff, feel free to jump in on our YouTube channel directly. So we won't see those comments on either on Twitter on um, or on Facebook if you are there. But you can watch it from there, but you just can't interact with us. So jump over to YouTube if you want to do that. So that said, Leroy, let's frame this up again. You contacted me yesterday, wanted to chat about this issue, a conversation you ran across. Conversations around reparations, around that concept, but there's a conflict that kind of came in that. And so to kind of frame that a little bit, what we're looking at.
Okay, so let me. Hopefully, I can say this really more succinctly than last time. So I read an article on a, a, a review of a review, and these two guys, Gregory Thompson and DeYoung, were reviewing Kevin DeYoung's book review on their book on reparations. So I figure every time these guys have got something important to say, I'm going to map out their argument so I can follow the logical flow of where they're going in their argument. And as I began to map out their argument, I realized that they had linked Kevin DeYoung's article within their article. So what I did was I just swooped over and read DeYoung's point of view and thought that it was ironic. It was the most magisterial discussion, and I mean magisterial in the sense that it was very thorough response to the ideas presented within their books. And
Yeah.
I thought to myself, hey, I need to go finish reading their article now because this has got to be, the equal to that logic and reason. And I was sadly disappointed, profoundly disappointed in their response. But I thought
In
it
the
was
response of Thompson and Kwan, right?
right, and I thought it was important because you know we're all struggling in the sense of trying to make sure that we are listening well to the folks on who are you know claiming critical race theory and all these other and progressive ideas and all those sorts of things. And we want to listen well to them, and we want to really interact with their arguments so that we can, make sure we're on the same page. And I thought that Quan and Thompson's article was excellent in showing us what their methodology and how they reason through these issues. And I thought that was valuable to talk to.
Yeah, and I think just so folks understand too is neither of us have read the book, so our discussion isn't about the content of the book on reparations that they've done. Maybe we'll do a show on that down the road. I did watch about an hour long interview discussion that they had. Both of those authors, did watch that. They talked at length about the book and their thesis and their ideas, and they presented their whole thing. So it's about an hour and 15 minutes of interview that they had. So I'm conversant enough, and I've read both of those articles. But the goal, I think, Leroy, when you wanted to talk about this yesterday, was not so that we're dealing with the issue of reparations so much, but how is it that we're supposed to enter to a dialogue about this when DeYoung is saying, and I read it, his opening was pretty generous. I thought he gave them all deference and all the benefit of the doubt in terms of their motivation and their passion for God and all those sort of things. Yet the way they framed the argument essentially was, well, we want to be generous too. DeYoung isn't a white supremacist, but he just argues like a white supremacist. This is essentially their entire, I'm sure he's not one. He just doesn't realize that he argues like one. And so I think that was kind of their way of being generous in the response, which was really interesting. But yeah, so that's what we're really talking about is the dialogue that we're trying to generate around these issues.
Yeah, their response is important, not so much for its content, not for what it says, but because it allows us to assess how they are arguing, their perspective and their point of view. Um, their book. If we're going to make comments on their book, we need to read their book. But their response to DeYoung is valuable, and I take it as such because when we think of white supremacy and the topic of white
Hmm.
supremacy, I know in my mind the Nazi skinheads and uh, all those other folks and Ku Klux Klan people, they come to mind. But when they talk about white supremacy, I think on one level they want to drag the stigma that comes with that title, white supremacy, into the argument. But they mean something somewhat different. They mean that the structure of the United States and the way in which it is organized is to disenfranchise non-whites and to benefit and privilege whites. So if you take it from that perspective, which is to say that the very structure in which we relate and our institutions are designed to disenfranchise um, those non-whites and to enfranchise, benefit, and privilege whites, now we can see, I think, the bankruptcy of their argument, because now we can actually take them at face value, because now they've laid their cards on the table, and we can actually see, how this works. So, and their argument is really important. So, what I did when I looked at this, I originally just started to say right off the bat. I mean, you could see that they never really interacted substantively with Kevin DeYoung's point of view, and I just immediately said this is the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is when you attempt to credit or discredit a thing on the basis of its origin rather on the content or its intent. And I think that that's exactly what they do in this article.
Yeah,
But
I think on two sides, just to jump in real quick, I think it was not just a genetic fallacy in terms of we're going to get rid of DeYoung because he's arguing as a white supremacist, even if he isn't one. But one of those other critiques in that was he didn't cite in his rebuttal, he didn't cite enough black scholars. Therefore, his response is also defective.
right,
But he was responding, doing a book thing. He was responding to their book, which is written by a white dude and an Asian dude, not by a black scholar. So, they accused him of centering whiteness, and they use all these kind of odd terms. In other words, keeping white people at the center. But he was only responding to their content, not to other people's content. So I kind of thought that the idea of that appeal to authority, as if like he didn't do it enough, didn't make much sense because he was responding to their book, which Thompson is a white dude. So,
yeah,
I mean, he's responding to a white guy responding to a white guy, and Quan was one of his co-authors, but here we are, a white dude and a black dude responding. So, I don't know. Leroy Hill, are you centering whiteness? Is that the problem?
no,
Are you ignoring the black perspective?
it is, it is, it is insanity. Um, the charge of centering whiteness is to say that white concerns are being foisted um, over and above everyone else's concerns. But again, if you take that stance or that way of argument, you're never really dealing with the substantive issue. You're simply saying,
Yeah.
well, he's white and he's taking white concerns. Well, the question is, what concerns is he actually bringing to the forefront, and what specifically makes them white? Um, so the authors want us to engage in um, you know some sort of kabuki theory, if you will, some insane
Yeah.
reasoning in which we never really get to the person's argument, and we just argue about how they argue, or what they look like, or that they didn't talk to enough black people. I'm going to assume that the authors themselves, even though they say they've been in dialogue with black people, I mean, which black people have they been in dialogue with?
Yeah, that was a real question. Actually, I sent you a clip. I sent you a link. You probably didn't have time because you were trying to be at work. But, with Thompson, where he said, that basically his view is shaped by, one of the things he talked about, the white community, white people generally want to talk about reconciliation, and black people want to talk about reparations. And I wanted to ask you, man, is that true that's what, when you're around black people, that's what you guys talk about as Christians, or in communities? Because that's what he said was his motivation, that black people, when you talk, that's all they care about. Yeah, I
It's a
don't know.
it's a very interesting
And maybe it
The
is.
same
I don't know.
way Black people want to talk about reparations. So, I'm 54 years old. I'm going to be 55 in, later
Hmm.
this year. Reparations was never on um, the table of discussion 20 years ago. It wasn't on the discussion. It wasn't in discussion in high school. Every time we learned about reparation, it was 48% of me. Right now, if you ask me about reparations, I'm simply going to ask, well, what was affirmative action? If that wasn't a form of reparations, not only a form of affirmative action, um, what is the welfare system? I mean, now they would argue that that's not really directed at Black people solely, but it doesn't matter whether it's directed at Black people solely. It is a form of benefit from the government to care for you and your needs. Who benefits from that? Everybody does, you will say, but that is a form of the government and the people and the taxpayers of this country taking care of people to the tune of $14 trillion. I mean, uh,
Yeah.
I, the
Yeah,
argument
and I
is
think that's where DeYoung kind of deals with that a little bit in his response, and they sort of said, "Well, yeah, we agree that we don't know how this is going to work. We just, but to question it at all is white
yeah,
supremacy."
yeah,
Let me give people, folks. Let me just jump. I want to give this. So I'm gonna read Greg Thompson's bio, but I'm gonna read it from the generous framework from which he reinterprets DeYoung. In other words, I'm going to include some little commentary on the side that I want to reinterpret. And he's applying one standard to DeYoung that I don't think he's applying that standard to himself because he feels like he's holding a certain viewpoint
right.
that is responsive and open. But here we go. So this is Greg Thompson's bio, written, read and interpreted from the lens of a critical race theory proponent, right? So here's his official bio. Greg Thompson's work focuses on race and equity in the United States. He serves as executive director of Voices Underground, initiative to build a national memorial in the Underground Railroad outside of Philadelphia, which, pause, sounds like a white guy trying to colonize the story of Black liberation. I mean, why is he the executive director? That's white power at the top of retelling a Black story. Sounds like white colonization to me. Anyway,
Sounds like
so we
too.
read on. Research fellow. He's a research fellow at African American Heritage at Lincoln University, which is a historically Black Christian university. Again, colonization of the Black education space. Why is he taking a space that should be for a Black scholar? Why is a white scholar
Exactly.
there?
Exactly.
I don't understand that. Is he trying to center his whiteness?
I
Uh,
think that he is. I think he's trying to center white voices in that space. And I know
I
that we're being
and Leroy,
hyperbolic,
if you say that, I can't argue against you
right?
because you are a
Because
Black man
you're
saying
you're
that.
white and I'm Black, and you have to listen to my voice and my experience.
Let me give the end of this, and then you can jump in after I finish bio. Okay. So, and he's a visiting theologian in Mission Grace Mosaic Church in Washington D.C., which I have no idea what it means to be a visiting theologian at a church. So he is co-creator of Union, the musical soul and hip hop based musical about 1968 sanitation worker strike. That seems like cultural appropriation. If he is the co-writer of a hip-hop musical about the sanitation strike for Black freedom, that seems again like colonization, cultural appropriation, white guy trying to define hip-hop. Seems like me. And then he earned his PhD from University of Virginia's Department of Religious Studies, which the last I looked is part of the educational white supremacist institutional system. So what does that credential really mean is that he knows how to be a white supremacist. So there is my fair and impartial reading of his profile as a representative of CRT, applying equally to him the standard he applies to DeYoung. Anyway, that's my little
And
tongue-in-cheek response there.
now, when we say that, people think that we're being hyperbolic, but we're really reading his article the way in which he responded to DeYoung's article, which was to just take it at face value and say this is a white person who is centering his own experience. And in this case, what he's done, if you just take his bio straightforwardly on their logic, what they've done is they've simply done exactly what they claim they hate, which is in his case, he's taking jobs away from jobs that should be for black men
Yeah.
who've experienced these things, who have equal, credentials. I mean, why is he teaching at an HBCU? Why shouldn't a black man hold that job? What qualifies him for that particular job? He doesn't have the same experience as a black man. As a matter of fact, he's probably got more privilege than most black men who do have PhDs in
Yeah.
order to sit in that seat. I mean, if
And
we
why is he the executive director of this project to build a monument to the? I mean, that executive means he's in the position of power at the top, and there's a white man instituting power and control over a system that. Why should we
it talks
believe
about
that?
black
Why
people
is
in their
that?
history. It talks about us in our history, and then frames it for us, so that, or like
Yeah.
he's chewing it up so that we can chew it up ourselves. And neither one of us are serious in this critique.
No.
I just want to say that for anybody who'll see this, we're not serious in this critique. But what we're attempting to do is show the fallaciousness of the reasoning that never takes people by the content of their character, but always seeks to undermine their capabilities, their abilities, and their achievements because of their color and their simply because of their color. And we don't think
Yeah.
that
And we could do the same thing to Quan too, just so we know. Quan, who is also not a black guy but an Asian guy, and writing again, trying to write the story of black people. But he was a church guy, an associate pastor, but that level of power wasn't good. So he started his own church where he is now in the power position, and his associate pastor is a black guy. So why is he an Asian in a position of power over a black man? And he claims that he's in one of the most ethnically diverse parts of the nation's capital, where his church is at. Yet we looked at the staff page; it was majority white
and Asian, yeah,
or
exactly.
white passing.
In
So
a supposedly neighborhood of color. I mean, where are
yeah.
not more black people represented on his staff?
There's not equity. There is not equity in his staff. If you look at the population, demographics, I'm pretty sure it's like 70%. I think non-white. I think blacks are. What is it in D.C.? I know I heard it the other day. I can't.
DC is called Chocolate City for a reason.
Yeah, I mean, there's a high 60%, 70%. It's high. I can't remember, but I would expect to see that same representation in his church if that's where the community is at. Yet I don't see that, and so this is the kind of stuff that people get. We're being a little tongue in cheek and silly here, but we're pointing out that just because they're saying this stuff, if that's the standard by which they measure everybody else, and they don't want to deal with the substance, then maybe they need to apply that to their own positions and recognize that it's time for them to step down because they're not following through, regardless of their great intentions. And since they have greater awareness of the problem, aren't they even more guilty because they seem to be repeating the sins of the past? And so I guess that this just points out, like you said, it's the problematic nature of this conversation. If you take the way they're having this conversation with DeYoung seriously, they're poisoning the well. It's poison before you even get to start to have the conversation, because before you go to drink, it's already suffering from some sort of poisonous nature of the way we've defined terms.
Yeah, they're never really getting to the person's ideas, and they're simply trying to disqualify them on the basis of skin color or this experience, and not really dealing with the content or the subject matter of what it is that he wrote. And that's not dialogue. That's actually an attempt. That's a power move and an attempt to silence someone. So they readily admit that Kevin DeYoung is not a white supremacist. By all measure, they say he's a fine Christian man who loves people and has on many occasions made lament over the state and status of the church. Yet they choose to label him with a very nasty and incredibly derisive term of white supremacy. I would have respected their view more if they had said, well, Kevin is ministering in a largely or predominantly white system, right? Most people would say, okay, that may be the case. At least that's an accurate framework. But to use the term white supremacy, smuggling in all the deleterious nature of a statement like that and then label it on someone who you say is a good man is pretty horrific and meant to silence and shut people up. And that's exactly the goal of it. Which is why when you finally make it to the meat of their article, it begins to fall apart, because why are no black voices in their response? Oh, they're quoting some black voices, but they should have pulled in a black voice who could have said how much they were hurt by Kevin DeYoung's writing.
Yeah. Yeah, his entire response article is a white-centered article from Thompson, because he's Thompson is the sole author.
Article.
He's centering a white.
And neither one of those have a black experience to which to draw from, even though they're citing some black people throughout history, or famous black people in the Reform movement. I want to see the black voice that is in their article, that is written from a first-person narrative that says, I read DeYoung's point of view, and here's my disagreement. See, even on their own view, they fail, because they're centering their own whiteness, their white knightism, and their white saviorism response in this whole article. And none of this gets to the real issue, which is to say that these are three learned men. I'm going to assume that all of them, that none of them are racist. I don't believe that any of them are racist, right? I'm just going to assume that from the very beginning. I'm going to assume that they all love Jesus and that they all are Bible-believing Christians. But here's the point.
And let me just say this too. Let me add to that before we get to that point too. I watched their interaction on this interview thing today, and they said a lot of very good things. And I actually thought that they tried to center on the gospel within their framework, how they understand it. I might have some disagreements about the way they did it, and I think DeYoung's critique was pretty fair in that, I think they talked about the importance of what Christ has done, and they tried to make that front and center to some level. So I don't have to question that. So I would agree from the tone that they had on this interaction when they're amongst themselves, it was great. It's just when they went in at Young, I just felt like, wow, that was crazy. But anyway, go ahead, finish your point too.
But I was going to say, I would say that these guys love the Lord, but in their response to Him, they were monstrous. They were horrific, and not substantive, and not to the point. They never really dealt with what they said. They dealt with His method, and then they labeled His method as white supremacist, rather than dealing with the content, which they would affirm is biblical. And I think that gets to the major second point. For these, their ultimate reality, or their ultimate view of things, is not that things need to be sound biblically or sound theologically. I mean, hopefully our theology matches and worldview matches the teachings of Scripture. But that's not really the goal for them. The goal for them is power. It is the manifestation, the use of the wielding of power to achieve a specific goal, which is to say that Kevin DeYoung, a guy who they acknowledge as a Christian, who loves the Lord and is not a white supremacist, is really a white supremacist. Not really dealing with whether anything he said was really white supremacy. You know what I mean? He's a white supremacist because he's white, because he thinks like a white person. Oh my gosh, they think like white people too.
Yeah, well, and that's, I think, the ironic part of both in the article, and it came across in this interview. I was watching it, but the article has this stuff too. There's an irony in the whole thing, because Thompson, I heard him say in the interview, he said that the white supremacy is a key characteristic of white supremacy, is that it's fixated on controlling the definitions of things, right? So white supremacy is like, you've got to accept my definition of terms and look at how, and it means it theologically. Like, white supremacy in a Christian theological context was, hey, when you use the term reconciliation, you mean a certain thing, and you get, and they were like, that's being pedantic, or you're overly fixated on what words mean, and they try to use the meaning of words to tear down what you're trying to get across. And that's what white supremacy does, is it tries to define the words you're looking at, and it controls that. But then, yet the entire project that they go about is to, well, let's define what we mean by these terms, and then you have to accept the definition the way I'm defining it. The problem is, it's done by, and there I got decentering whiteness, recentering blackness. I mean, there again, two non-black people trying to center blackness, problematic. But what they end up doing is say, well, white theology, the way you define words, is wrong because you put white people at the center, and that's whiteness to define it that way. So let's redefine it through blackness, and then blackness will define it. But then once that moves into a system of supremacy, that it's the dominant definition, well, how about the other races that aren't black, that aren't white? That, what about Indian Americans? What about Asians that aren't like Korean? What about Japanese or the Chinese, or those that are actually from India? What about Hawaiians? What about all these Pacific Islanders? You can go every race. Now, don't we have to let them redefine all these terms that you've centered on blackness? And now should they be centered on all of their things? And can't they come with you and make this charge that you are ignoring their history and their story and their plight, and they're angry and all this, their anger, all this stuff? And that's exactly the problem. And I think DeYoung brings this out in his commentary. It's just a never-ending cycle of power and conflict and power and conflict. And Thompson and Kwan don't have a solution to that. They just sort of say, well, if you're just trying to stop us from decentering whiteness, as if that's the, I think it's like we're saying, no, if that's the goal, if that's how you do it, by decentering whiteness, by centering blackness, then what about the next racial group that's up? How do we deal with that in terms of actual, in our theology, in concepts of real framework of reconciliation and healing? There's no answer, and it really is frustrating.
Yet, not only is there no answer, it's perpetual victory, perpetual oppressors. The unity that Christ has wrought for us, the work of the Holy Spirit, is ultimately denied. Not just denied, dead on arrival. It is death. That is exactly what they are proclaiming for us. It is death. Nobody is to be seen as better than ourselves. Well, we can't do that because our pursuit is power. Our pursuit is our rights. Our pursuit is centering Chinese, or centering Filipino, or centering blacks, or centering every other voice. I think that when we wrestle with these issues, that we have to think. We have to think from their perspective. Their perspective is to say, okay, America is multi-ethnic. It's no way that it should privilege, whites in America. It should privilege everyone. Okay,
we all agree, yeah.
We agree with that. But how does that happen? Well, part of the way that happens is people go to the polls and vote for their elected officials, and they put their elected officials that they want in office, and those elected officials carry out their will. That happens in America every 2 years and every 4 years. People get to vote. But even in our voting, we don't all agree. And because we don't all agree, there's broad appeals, but not, uniform adherence to those appeals. And none of us should expect that. That's just not America. And what these gentlemen are suggesting is that the freedom that we have to think the way that we want about our neighbors, whether we love them or hate them, whether we agree with them or disagree with them, the freedom that we have in electing officials to be our voices, or to vote against people who are our voices. They want that all, it appears, to be done away with. And they want a different project, an authoritarian project that centers racial issues, or racial features and characteristics, and that seeks justice at all costs. Look, we live in a fallen world.
Yeah.
We live in a broken and fallen world. There will not be justice this side of heaven until Jesus Christ returns. It
Biblical
doesn't
justice,
mean we
yeah.
shouldn't work toward it, okay? But it just means that even our best efforts will fail. And I think in many ways we have this very unrealistic view of our own power and of reality. And you know,
Yeah. Yeah,
we get
yeah, I think, one of the things that struck me as I read their response and then uh, was listening to them talk is, here's a point of agreement, and I think this is important people understand. It is true that whites historically had a framework that elevated the ideal white as above other racial groups. I mean, the history is clear, and I've spent many years now studying that, and I know you've studied that over the years, and you've experienced some of that in your own life.
Mhm.
Unlike me, you've actually experienced some of that, but I've read enough and I've studied enough, just like Thompson has, that I can say, look, that's very true. And I'm even okay in principle with saying, okay, let's decenter whiteness. Okay, that's fine. Let's just broadly say that that's true. Let's not worry about how we're defining it so much, even though that's important. But we could get to that. But the corrective to that, what we put in the vacuum at the center of control, is what is at stake for me. It's you can't decenter whiteness and then center another racial group, blackness or Asianness or whatever term we're going to use to describe these ideas as if they're connected to one particular skin color. Because race is a social construct. It is an invention of the culture. And so we can't correct one cultural convention, which is a social fiction of whiteness, with another social fiction of blackness. Because what you have is a cultural solution to another cultural solution problem. So there's a problem of whiteness. Okay, let's say there's a problem there. But you can't have the solution be another racial centering of another social fiction. The solution has to be to replace that whiteness, whatever you want to define that as, with the truth of Scripture and the person of Jesus Christ and the work that Christ has done. And they said one very disturbing thing that really bugged me on this, and I can't remember if it was in the article or in the interview that I was listening to, but they said, white people want to start with reconciliation, but that's not the starting point. The starting point has to be restitution, or
right.
reparations. And I'm thinking, where is that biblically? I mean, biblically, Jesus, said, bread is not enough to sustain you. I'm the bread of life. Water is not, will make you only get thirsty again. I'm the water of life. Everything for I think if you even want to have a conversation about biblical concept of reparations. Okay, let's use that word. Just say if we want to frame that modern use of that word in a biblical framework, then you have to do it the way Jesus did. It says that everything does begin at the point of we're reconciled to God through Jesus Christ. And then once we have that reconciliation and we become a new creation, then there is a real genuine work. And it doesn't absolve us of our obligation to our brothers and sisters, but it gives us a framework that whatever that obligation might be to correct what was wrong, it's
Yeah,
done within a framework of family, not in a framework of people competing for power. And I think that's what they're missing in their whole response.
exactly. This becomes what they really hope for, what they say they want is family. This becomes brothers, white and black, Chinese, Puerto Rican, you name it, who say, I can no longer disenfranchise my brother or my sister. I must see my brother and sister as better than myself. And I actively began to take part in revitalizing, if you will, being restorative in those acts, if you will. But see, that's a work driven by the Holy Spirit, right? That's a work
Mhm.
that where the Spirit of God begins to convict me about the way that I've lived or what I've thought about, and now begins to move me toward action on the behalf of those people who I've taken advantage of, if I've taken advantage of those people, right? And maybe not even if I've taken advantage of those people, but because I see those people in need. That is a supreme work of the Holy Spirit, right? And what I think these guys are trying to do is guilt people, even people who have not themselves been um, involved in any of this. And when we look at these issues, whites the abolitionist movement does not move forward without white people, right? Getting rid of slavery does not move forward without white people. Civil rights doesn't move forward without white people. None of these issues begin to percolate because black people have never had enough power to do it on their own, right? None of these things happen without white people. But those white people whose efforts from the past and hopes and dreams of reconciliation and equality, they're trashed in this because they're really white supremacists too on these guys. They're white supremacists too, and their efforts are not benign. They're not Christian love. They're really guilt.
Yeah.
Being outworked. They're just not. None of this is biblical. I guess that's a way I would put it. None of this is really the work of the Holy Spirit leading me to live righteously and to love my brother and sister. None of that.
You know what strikes me? You know what strikes me as you talk there, Leroy? Their article talks about this corporate sin, the we that is responsible for sin, the we that. So even though we're generations removed, white folk today are responsible for, the descendants of, black folk yesterday, or all that kind of stuff. There's this corporate thing, and they try to trace this biblically, and they give their argument for that. And the substance of that argument, let's put aside, because we know when we try to deal with the substance, that's only a form of white supremacy. So we won't deal with the substance of their argument. Yeah. But let me look at it this way. What does strike me, though, is if there is such a thing as corporate guilt, why isn't there such a thing as corporate absolution? Because that's kind of what you were just driving at. So if all people today, all whites today, are responsible for the sin of slavery, which, by the way, they conflate slavery with racism problematically throughout their stuff. One of their examples they use is from, somebody arguing for reparations in 1715. That's before the concept of racism even existed. So, they're conflating terms as a convenient narrative, meta-narrative that they're trying to foist on everybody. But again, we don't want to get stuck in the details because that's bad. But yeah, so if they're saying, everybody then has a corporate obligation to right this historic wrong, what about don't we have a corporate absolution? I mean, if hundreds of thousands of white people died to end slavery in the Civil War,
them from all this.
If there are white
relatives on the Union side in the Civil War, find their families and exempt them from all of this.
No. We should all be exempt, right? If we're all guilty,
I'm agreeing,
right?
Right. I'm agreeing.
Right? Shouldn't we all be exempt on their actions as well? What about on behalf of if I'm responsible for the individual slaveholder who had slaves, then what about the individual abolitionist who was killed himself or herself?
Yeah, exactly.
To fight for equality. So then I should also receive their great
corporate absolution.
Corporate absolution.
You better
right?
Believe it. And that's the only reasonable way to deal with these things. But see, you're being too logical. You're being too reasonable here. I mean, if they were to take you seriously at your word, then nobody could ever be held guilty for anything except when they stand before the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just.
I just struck me as funny because when you were talking about that, that we that's responsible, in the context of the way they do it. So, for example, I mean, they go from modern examples as well of how, there's this sense of corporate guilt. And again, I'm not saying that, we're not dealing with the substance of reparations and if people have actually been wronged, could there be rights? I mean, specifically, Asians who were interned in internment camps, during World War II, many have children that, their parents had or grandchildren had their businesses taken from them or artwork taken from them. There's a direct thing. So we're not arguing against this concept in principle. They seem to argue a lot of times that they think, just white people are afraid of that term reparations and they won't talk about it. We're not afraid to talk about it. We're not saying that there isn't a dialogue to be had here. The concern is let's deal fairly with that. Let's define it in a way that makes sense is all I'm saying. Let me define a way that I can understand that makes sense. So for example, if During World War, we fought Hitler, right? And because Hitler was responsible, connected through his allies for the attack in the United States, that is why we interned Japanese, right? That were Americans. Well, who were the Japanese that attacked us? They were the ones, Japan, aligned with Hitler. So they were on the side of white supremacy because they believed in Japanese superiority and Japanese racial superiority. They had kind of bought into that program as well. So yes, the United States was wrong to put Japanese Americans into internment camps simply because they were Japanese. But what about the responsibility for reparations of the Japanese government itself? Because they allied with Hitler. Right. And so shouldn't they be responsible for reparations to, you know, the Jews or the gypsies or the gays or all the people that were, you know, killed by Hitler's action? Because they were his ally. They helped propagate the system of power.
And actually
what is their responsibility?
Actually fought and killed on behalf of it.
Yeah, they fought and killed on behalf of Hitler's white supremacy. So all I'm saying is, if your answer to this issue of reparations isn't coherent to deal with the complexities, the actual challenges of history, then it's probably because it's a bad answer. Now, I'm not saying they have a bad answer. I'm saying that's the challenge I would posit, to say, look, can it deal with those complexities in a way that is actually appropriate, or does it still fixate on skin color alone as the problem? Does it still fixate on America alone and not recognize that, you know, okay, the millions of African slaves that were brought before the concept of race existed, by the way, but who were they sold by? They were sold by fellow African tribes. Yeah. The darker skinned and lighter skinned tribes had, you know, they had their own ethnic problems. How do we deal with that? Who's responsible?
It did here in America. I mean, it continued on in Brazil and other places for decades.
Oh yeah.
I'm just saying, I guess here's the valuable part. If we're gonna, really think about it, we now know that by white supremacy they mean the way that America works. So ultimately, their goal has to be to overturn the way that America works. And what does that mean? That means that when we think about logic, that needs to be done away with. When we think of what an orthodox view of God is that arises from Scripture and how we arrive at that, that's racist too, on their view.
Yeah.
When we think about our institutions and how our institutions form, whether they were created by black people or not, they're racist too because they're founded on white supremacy. The question that is never asked of these gentlemen is, what would they put in its place? Now that's not a challenge to say put nothing in its place, right? I'm not suggesting that. I just want to know from them, what would they put in its place? What would they put in its place? And
it seems like the answer is blackness or black-centeredness or something. Black power, I guess.
Well, I'm all for being in charge. I mean, since beneficiaries, go DuPont and go Greg Thompson, right? Because once you get me in charge, boy.
Yeah, I think you should be in charge of them. I think they should be responsible to you.
Put me in charge. You put me in charge, boy.
Well, it'll be something. Think about this too, and I guess I don't want to go too far down this road because I know it sounds, because it's been used before. This isn't an original point, but it's true that if we look at if we're going to say, generationally, we have a moral, and this is our thing as Christians, we have a moral obligation for what has been done in the past from a ostensibly secular government. They're trying to, turn the U.S. into some sort of theocracy where Christian morals and ethics are determinative of where it goes. Okay, so we could go down that road. But they're saying, hey, our secular government has to be responsible for this, and this is part of the Christian mission, to make these governments responsible. Well, what about the tribes and nations in Africa, in the continent of Africa, that exist today? So, we don't know where every individual came from. Well, that's fine, because they say it doesn't matter whether, you, Leroy Hill, may not be descended from slavery, but you are still part of the system that oppresses you. So therefore, you're due reparations. From me, even if my family immigrated at a much later time or whatever, no matter what their history is, I'm still responsible for, providing those reparations because I'm on the other side of the racial spectrum from you. Well, what about those nations in Africa that actually sold the slaves. Now, we can't trace who did what, but that shouldn't matter under that same standard. If we know that millions of slaves came along the Gold Coast or from or the Ivory Coast and from Nigeria or West Africa or wherever it came from, shouldn't those peoples be responsible for reparations to Black Americans?
Yeah.
What does that look like? I mean, of course, they don't want to talk about what that looks like because they think that's whiteness. But I mean, I'm being serious. If we know that people were removed from their homeland, what about everybody? 100 acres in where the country of their choosing, like in Africa, would that be reparations? And I mean that sincerely. I'm not being silly here by saying that. I mean, would that constitute a genuine reparation? Because if people were stolen, it's their whole big thing is return to people what was stolen, return what was stolen, return what was stolen. Well, at this point, what was stolen is they were stolen from their homes, generationally in Africa. Is that a legitimate? And I ask, what if you, Leroy Hill, wanted that? And what if you said, yes, I want reparations, and I want mine in the form of 100 acres or 1,000, whatever it would be, in pick your country in South Africa, maybe somewhere. Do you get that? Is that part of it? I would like to know. I mean, I don't know.
Let me tell you.
Have you ever heard anyone discuss that?
Their rebuttal would say, "Oh, well, we can talk about that, but let's talk about America first, right? Let's deal with what's going on in America first, right? Because again, now in saying that, they never really have to deal with the central point that you're making, which is they themselves recognize that the whole concept of giving back reparations is fraught with problems and complexities that involve taking from people who have rightly gained their goods and giving it to other people. They create more problems than they wish. And again, the next question is, okay, now that you give reparations, why wouldn't you owe reparations to someone who's born 50 years from now, who are descendants of people who you acknowledge now that you stole from? Why wouldn't you give reparations 100 years from then to the children of those people who are the children or the grandchildren of, or the great grandchildren of people who you acknowledge that you stole from? Well, one thing about reparations is it's returning to the person, the thing that was stolen from them. In other words, it's repairing the person who was directly harmed. And as far as I know, there are no slaves that are alive today to which to pay reparations to.
And they address that with that sort of vague idea of, well, yeah, but they're descendants and therefore it's stolen. But how do you return what was stolen? I mean, without, first of all, taking away specifically something, I don't know. But if you say, okay, let's have a solution. The U.S. government is going to print $10 billion or $10 trillion, and they're just going to give cash out to every person of color. They're just going to give, $1 million, $10 million. Why not $100 million? Sure, why not? Every person of color gets $100 million. Just going to print it from the Treasury. But any economic system falls in that. Inflation kicks in, it destroys the system. So that $100 million I gave you becomes meaningless. So now I've not really given them any reparations because I've given them $10 by the time inflation kicks in, and that money becomes meaningless. So you can't just print money to do it. You have to take from a limited source. And how do you do that? And I get that their criticism of DeYoung was, well, he's saying these things, that's centering whiteness because he's using that to delegitimize our argument. I'm saying, no, let's accept your argument that's true. Let's accept we have a moral obligation for reparations. Let's just say that we have that. And I think DeYoung makes that point. Let's accept that that's the premise. Give me details of what to do. Well, I said, well, we're just wrestling with that. We don't know the answer either, but we're wrestling with it. Well, so is DeYoung, it seemed like in his article. He's saying, well, let's wrestle with it now. Let's explain to me. Well, you can't just dismiss it because no one said they were dismissing. I just don't get, they want to have a conversation, and then when people have a conversation, they dismiss them as white supremacists.
Yeah, because they're really not interested in the conversation. And that's the part that's totally and thoroughly head scratching, is that they claim to want a conversation. No, they want a monologue. They don't want a dialogue. They want a monologue. They want to say and certify their own views. They don't want to appeal to anything logical or reasonable, and hold logic and reason and objective standards above all these things to which we appeal and that frame our arguments. They simply want to say and not be challenged in their statements. Because if they were really interested in a dialogue, I mean, Kevin DeYoung's article in response to them was fit. I mean, I wish I had counted how many citations of their work that he has in his book review. But
That was a lot. That was a long article.
It's about, I think it's like 27 pages. I think it's about 40 or 50, at least 40 or 50 citations, from their 200-page book. So I would just simply say, they're not really interested in a dialogue.
And it just occurs to me, they said that he didn't engage with black scholars, but isn't that the corporate we? He was engaged. If they engaged with black scholars and he engaged with their work, then he was engaging with black scholars. It's the corporate representation. Oh no, I'm sorry. That only applies to their arguments. You can't actually apply.
Because they have rules for me, but not for thee.
For thee. That's right. Man, it's crazy. All right. Well, I hope folks listening had at least a little bit of framework for this conversation, and understand that people can just do an internet search. They can find these articles. They can locate this stuff that we've been talking about. But feel free to shoot us an email, send us a conversation piece from morethancake.org or from our site at the Center for Cultural Apologetics.org, and you can reach us that way and connect with us through all the social media platforms, and we're more than happy to engage. But I'm glad you jumped on this, Leroy. It's a busy time for both of us. I know you're still supposed to be working right now, and I'm in the middle of finishing my PhD stuff, and so we hope to be back at a. And you got to finish your own dissertation that you've been working on, thesis you've been working on. So we're going to try to get back on a regular basis, on a weekly basis here as soon as possible. So thanks for hanging in, folks, and we'll get to a good time sooner or later, a good regular time sooner or later. So appreciate it. Take care, and God bless. Peace out.